Hi everyone, welcome to this lecture. So in this lecture, we will learn about the working of support vector machine. So we will see how support vector machine classifier works and how it is different from KNN and the logistic regression classifier. But the common thing between the support vector machine, the KNN and the logistic regression is that all of these three classifiers are the discriminative classifiers. That is, they need a boundary or a straight line or a hyperplane in order to separate the data into different classes. But we will also study how support vector machine is different from KNN or the logistic regression model. So let's see how support vector machine, or in short SVM, works. So here we have a data, we have a two kind of data. We can see that we have a negative data and we have a positive data. So in order to separate this data using support vector machine, we need to draw a line because the support vector machine is the discriminative model. Okay, so how to separate this data? So this is one of the many possible straight lines that could be drawn in order to separate the data. So this is the vertical straight line and it has successfully separated these two data classes. So what are the other possibilities? So all these three lines are or could be used in order to separate the negative label from the positive label, or the negative class from the positive class. So these are only three lines here, but we can draw even 3000 lines here. We can draw as many lines as possible in order to separate the data. Now the question is, which line is the best? So that best line is selected by the support vector machine. So support vector machine is a classifier which finds the best line in order to separate the two classes, or in order to separate the data set into the different classes. So here we can see that we have three lines, and we can also draw the large number of lines here between these two classes in order to separate the classes. So which line is the best? So here we can see that the line with the magenta color is the best line. Why this line is the best line? Because it has maximum margin on both sides of the data set, that is on both labels of the data set. So we can see that here we have the negative class of the data, here we have the positive class of the data. So this line has a maximum margin on both sides of the data set, and this maximum margin is calculated with the help of data sample. Here we have a data sample in the negative class, and here we have a data sample in the positive class. So the distance of the nearest data sample with this line is called the maximum margin, or this will help us to create the maximum margin. Similarly, this is the maximum margin on the positive side of the data, or towards the positive label of the data, and this is the maximum margin towards the negative label of the data. So basically, support vector machine is different from the previous classifiers, that it always look for a maximum margin on both sides of the labels. That is, it looks for a maximum distance so that there should not be any misclassification. So here is the distance. So in order to perform the misclassification, or in order to have the misclassification, this data point has to travel all along the line and cross the line in order to do the misclassification. Since the distance is a maximum margin distance, therefore it is not easy for any data point of one sample to go towards the other sample. So this is the important concept of the maximum margin classifier, that is the support vector machine classifier. So the support vector always looks for the maximum margin on both sides of the label, so that it can perform it with some distance, with some clarity. So that is the difference between the support vector machine and the other classifier, that this is the maximum margin classifier. Okay, now these two data points are called the support vectors. So these are the support vectors because they helping this support vector or support vector classifier in order to create the maximum margin on both sides of the hyperplane. So this is our boundary, this is our hyperplane, which is separating both two classes, and these are two data samples. So this is the data sample in the negative class, and this is the data sample in the positive class, which are nearest to this hyperplane. So these data samples are called the support vectors, and the support vector ensure that the classification is performed with the maximum margin. So again, these are the our support vector, and now we call this line as a maximum margin hyperplane. So we have a maximum margin, we have a support vector, a negative support vector, and the positive support vector, and we call this boundary as a maximum margin hyperplane. So the target of a support vector machine classifier is to create a hyperplane which has the maximum margin on both sides of the data or on both sides of the labels. So here we can see that this is the negative hyperplane. This hyperplane is crossing on the negative support vector, and this is our positive hyperplane. So this is our positive hyperplane, and this is passing over the positive support vector. So this is our support vector on the positive hyperplane. This is our support vector on the negative hyperplane, and this is our maximum margin hyperplane. So in this lecture, we learn how support vector machine works. We see that support vector machine is trying to get the best line which is separating the data by using a maximum margin concept. So support vector machine uses support vectors in order to create the maximum margin on both sides of the data, that is towards the positive label and towards the negative label of the data. In that case, we will get the maximum margin hyperplane, which is called the support vector classifier. So this is the fundamental concept of the support vector classifier, that it always look for the maximum margin, and this is the difference between the support vector with the other classifier. So I hope you understood this fundamental lecture on support vector machine. Thanks for listening, and I will see you in the next lecture.